Good afternoon, dear guests, and welcome on behalf of the Organizing Committee of Ukraine House Davos. My name is Uliana Chromyak, and I'm the Executive Director, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of the panel. The moderator, BRONWEN MADDOX, Director and Chief Executive at Chatham House. And BRONWEN, please introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to borrow your microphone. I've been in some sessions in Davos that were standing room only, but I don't think any that have been corridor room only. Anyway, welcome. And I could hear just coming along the sidewalk, the buzz that was around this particular session. I was really excited when I was invited by Davos, who put together this panel, to have this discussion. Let me make clear, I'm here as the moderator, and this is not a balanced panel. This is people who have been passionately involved in making this argument, and what we're going to do today is explore the state of this argument about giving Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine, the different counter-arguments, and what the state of the politics is as well. Starting from the end, we have ROSTYSLAV SHURMA, Deputy Head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, who was fluent just upstairs in some of these arguments. I said, let's save it for now. We have Bill Browder, many of you know, who is a CEO, financier, activist, writer, eloquent on these subjects and many related. On my right, Timothy Ash, who's a financier, also affiliated with Chatham House, who is, again, very steeped in these particular arguments. And at the end, YULIYA ZISKINA, Senior Legal Fellow of RAZOM, the think tank and activist group working for Ukraine. Well, and welcome to you all. Let me start. I'm going to start with a micro comment from Tim Ash, just to take us into the figures of the assets that we're talking about.
Sure. Well, incredibly, I think I've got one of these. Incredibly, a couple of years, well, almost 2 years into the invasion, we don't really have a number in terms of the total. I mean, there was a very good FT piece quite recently, about a month ago. We think CBR assets, Central Bank of Russia assets, is somewhere between 300 and 350 billion. It's probably around 100 billion of oligarch assets. We kind of know...
Dollars, we're talking.
Dollars we're talking about. We kind of know probably around 160, 170 billion is with Ukraine and Belgium. France, I think, has a significant amount of money, and then there's pots, little bits of money elsewhere, a small amount in the US, a small amount in the UK, and a significant amount in the Channel Islands, interestingly. But anyway, I'll end it there.
Significant amount. Bill, that amount is?
Well, I haven't actually seen the bank statements for myself, but we understand that Jersey sits on something like $7 billion of Russian central bank reserves.
Thank you. The detail that makes these things really bite home. All right, let's start. ROSTYSLAV, if you could start by just telling us in a nutshell where this argument is, because it has been put in place for many long months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it has really got extra political heat and even momentum in recent weeks and months. And I'm thinking just from the UK side of David Cameron also adding the UK's support to this. Where are we now?
Good afternoon to everybody. In fact, yes, this topic got really the true momentum a couple of months ago, specifically the recent weeks. I remember when on the previous Davos, we were discussing this topic, the same topic, on the very similar panel. I think it was more like our dreams in some time, in some period, to touch those assets. But today we see that this is absolutely realistic task that will be achieved in quite manageable periods of time. Why it happens so? Our understanding. This is all about the political will. We need to understand it absolutely clearly, weighted on the risks, on the legal mechanisms, but this is all about the will. Why the will of our partners has appeared. So as you know, we are experiencing the shortages in our budget, close to 40 billion. We are funded 2022, 2023. The packages are not yet voted in 24, but we are absolutely confident that both packages will be adopted, both in the US and the European Union, so the 2024 will be closed. The question is, what's next? Because obviously some volume of the support will sustain. Obviously, we expect that the economy will grow, and it means that we'll have the higher tax revenues. Obviously, we as the government will do some kind of homework to optimize the shortages, but at least we understand that it will be roughly 10 to 15 billion that would need to be covered extra. And if you compare it with the potential number of the earnings that can be received from the frozen assets, the numbers quite correspond, assuming the existing interest rates on the market. So this is one of the most important reasons. And now we have to break the big topic of the monetization or confiscations of the Russian assets into two big parts. The first, which is quite achievable and quite reasonable in short periods of time, which is the earnings from the frozen assets. And the second part is the confiscation of the asset itself. So on the earnings, I think a year ago, it was still not a topic, because a year ago, the interest rates, the policy rates were absolutely different. We were in the era of almost zero interest rates. So it meant, okay, $1 billion, $2 billion that could be generated by those assets. They didn't mean anything to the whole situation. But today, when we have the policy rates between 4 and 5, when the yields of the treasuries, of the bonds, of the AAA bonds, may achieve 4%, 3.5%, sometimes even 5%, depending on the durations. So we are speaking about the number between 10 to 15 billion, which is quite material. Moreover, the legal case and the political case is much easier for that. Maybe I will go into more details during the discussion. And at the same time, just a couple of weeks ago, the topic of the asset itself as well has been raised to the agenda on the G7. There are different countries with the different positions. There are those who are pushing this actively. There are those who are supporting that. And there are a couple of countries who are opposing that as well because of the absolutely clear reasons. But again, during the discussion, I'll stop on that a bit more in details.
Thank you very much indeed. All right, you've taken us right into the heart of it. There's a key G7 discussion and decision even coming up on this, probably in February. And countries getting their positions clear at the moment, and a distinction between the assets themselves and the interest earned on them. So I want to turn to Yuliya now and just take us into some of the legal arguments for this. Let me say this is not my own point of view, but as there is no one here to put the counter-argument to this, let me do that. And I'm thinking in particular of a Financial Times editorial just a few days before Christmas, 21st of December, where the paper, which has been very much a supporter of defending Ukraine for itself and for the security of Europe, nonetheless came out against seizing such assets, saying, look, the West and Ukraine and all the supporters are mounting the defense as part of their defense of the rules-based international order. And it is really problematic if, as part of that, these countries go and do something which could be argued to undermine those rules or be making up those rules, such as seizing another country's assets. And there is a particular problem, they argued, with taking central bank assets, because that could undermine the security that countries feel in placing the central bank assets in the currency of another country. So that is, if you like, the counter-argument against seizing Russia's money. Yuliya, you have, I think, and you were trying out on us upstairs, many of the responses to this. Perhaps you'd like to give us an airing of some of them.
Absolutely. But I do want to frame this from the very beginning. I want to frame it as a fundamental starting point that the reality is that this money is not going back to Russia. The G7 has agreed to that publicly twice. The real debate is over actually whether Ukraine gets this money and when. And Ukraine is already owed this money under international law. But let me be clear, as ROSTYSLAV just said, the barrier to asset seizure aren't really the legal questions anymore. It is political will. Legal concerns have often been used as a get out of making difficult decisions card. Asset seizure has been purported as some kind of unsolvable legal puzzle. And these exact same talking points are the ones that we've heard and decision makers have repeated since even last January up until this very week. But the reality actually is that during this past year, these legal questions have largely been untangled and a clear legal basis has been established by the world's leading international law practitioners, scholars, some of the highest ranked individuals you possibly could find. So at this point, there's not really going to be any new insight or value add from more lawyers and more legal discussions. What's already been said there's no more.
Yeah. Julia, we will come on to the politics, but I wondered, just for the benefit of this discussion and the people here, if you could, you are a lawyer, just take us into your view of why the legal arguments are so, in your view, decisive that this is possible.
Absolutely. So there is actually a legal doctrine under international law called countermeasures. I can talk more in depth about it later. The basic idea is that countermeasures are a self-help tool to enforce international obligations in situations exactly like this, where institutions have failed. So when a state's conduct is so egregious that it violates the very core norms of international law, it's considered to affect the entire global community, and every country has the standing and the right to take countermeasures against it. So the countermeasures are intended to stop the wrongful conduct and to compel the payment of compensation. Their countermeasures are, by definition, acts that would normally be wrongful, such as interfering with another sovereign's property, but their wrongfulness is precluded because it's in response to a serious breach of international law by that state. So asset freezes and asset confiscation are examples of those kinds of countermeasures. The basic idea, in a nutshell, is that no country can have it both ways. Aggressors can't violate every tenet of the rule of law and then use it to claim protection for their property. So we already have this legal foundation, and it was devised for situations like this, and policymakers just need to make the decision to use it.
Thank you very much indeed. You put it very, very clearly. Bill,
let me maybe just comment on that, yes?
Can I come? I'll come to you again at the end. May I come to Bill a bit to expand on this question? Could you possibly grab ROSTYSLAV's microphone? Because we're sharing. It's not to. No, it's not to stop you talking. I will absolutely come back to you. I will absolutely come back to you. Bill, where are we on this? So you set out the argument of why. Look, the legal argument is one. The political argument is not quite one, is it?
So no, not yet. So just for the benefit of everyone here who doesn't know me, so when the war started, like every single person in this room and every single person in any civilized country, I watched the war and I was heartbroken, horrified, and called to action. And every person has a different way of helping, and different people have helped, and a lot of people in this room have helped in a lot of different ways. The way I could help was that I've spent the last decade and a half fighting to get asset freezing sanctions imposed on Russia through the Magnitsky Act. And I know all the players, I know all the politicians, all the government officials. I'm probably the most experienced person in terms of freezing assets, and a week after the war started, we froze, I should say we, the West, froze between 300 and 350 billion of these assets. And so what I can contribute to this is to talk to all those people to figure out how we can seize those assets. And I've spent the last almost 2 years meeting with members of parliament in different countries and Congress, with governments, trying to make the case, as many other people have been. And what started as a non-starter, and I think we even discussed this a while ago, where nobody thought it was possible, and for different reasons people didn't want to do it. In the United States, and nobody will say this explicitly, but the US government at the very beginning of this whole thing, some of the top people had this fantasy that a peace deal could be struck very quickly, and nobody wanted to give up or confiscate the money, because that could be a bargaining chip. That's I think it's become clear that no peace deal is coming quickly, and that would be not a good idea to use it as a bargaining chip. And then, of course, there was everybody in Europe saying, well, this is impossible, we can't do this, this is illegal. And I've been to Brussels on a number of occasions. We've had various events at the European Parliament and with the European Commission. And what I find so interesting as the case evolves, they said, no, we can't do this. And now they say, oh, we can do this, but we can only confiscate the interest. We can't confiscate the principal. And what we're seeing is that it's kind of a slippery slope. It's kind of like the tanks. Everyone said, no, absolutely no possibility of tanks. And then there were tanks, absolutely no possibility of long-range missiles, and there's long-range missiles. Absolutely no possibility of F-16s, and there's F-16s. We're now at a place, and it feels pretty clear. David Cameron spoke at the Aspen Institute a couple weeks ago, and he pretty much is making the same case that we are here making today, which is that it's the right thing to do morally, politically, and financially to confiscate these assets. The US government has issued some statements saying that they support it. I don't think it can be done unless everybody does it together. And we'll talk about this in a second.
Who do you mean by everybody?
What I mean by everybody is you can't have the US doing it and not the Europeans doing it, because the big fear is that who's going to keep their money in dollars if this can happen, and if they can keep their money in euros. But if all reserve currencies, euro, dollar, sterling, yen, do it at the same time, then where is China, where is Saudi Arabia, where are these other countries with a lot of
So
reserves?
just going back to Rostislav's first point about where we are now, so in your view, this would take a G7 agreement and a European Union agreement?
I think that the European Union has to be involved. I don't believe, so 220 billion of the 300 to 350 is in Belgium. I can't imagine the Belgian government taking the strident position on this thing without the full complete support of the European Union.
Thanks very much. All right, Tim, can I turn to you? And perhaps to what I put as the second counter argument, that look, if this is done, it will really destabilize the international financial system and shake the dollar and the euro. And any other points you want to make, but I would love your views on that.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, but for me it's about the national security imperative. It's about the political reality, and it's about the economic facts. National security priority, I would say Ukraine's victory in the war and successful reconstruction should be the #1 national security priority of the NATO alliance. It's the biggest challenge, the biggest need since the end of communism, 89-91. Stopping Russian aggression, because if Putin wins in Ukraine, he will continue, right? It's interesting we talk about rule of law to defend. There will be no rule of law if Putin wins this battle, right? Secondly, it's interesting the economics of it, right? What's the economic cost of supporting Ukraine, right? At the moment, we're spending about $100 billion a year in war, which is basically 40 billion budget support, 60 billion in terms of military support. If we think of reconstruction needs, lots of estimates, 500 billion, but let's say 50 billion a year for the next 10 years. That's a huge ask of Western taxpayers, right? And I would say the political reality in a global cost of living crisis is, I don't think there's appetite, and it's a hard thing to say, I don't think there's appetite in Western democracies to write that check for such a long period of time. And we're already seeing the reality. The 61 billion stuck in the US Congress, the 50 billion been blocked by Orban. And I would push the argument back. Those people who argue that we can't do with it, hiding behind legal arguments, I challenge them and say, if we don't do this, how are we going to fund Ukraine's victory in war and success in full reconstruction? And what happens if we don't, right? What happens if Ukraine loses the war and loses the peace? I would say it means much increased defense spending for the West, and it means potentially, if we fail with the reconstruction and Ukraine fails in war, social and political collapse in Ukraine, mass migration flows out of Ukraine into Europe, massive destabilization and push for populism, right? So basically, needs must.
So
right? Laws. Can I just?
Yeah, go on.
You know, politicians and policymakers make laws. That, you know, and in the end, it's interesting. We're in Switzerland, and we're bondholders, and it's interesting that the Swiss government retrospectively changed laws when there was a national security imperative when Credit Suisse failed. So you can do it when you want to, and I think in the end, with this one, it is such a national security imperative that we fund Ukraine. Clearly, there's a massive problem funding Ukraine at the moment, and we have to basically change laws to make it happen. And I think, interestingly, the change in mood music we've seen in the last couple of months, suddenly with the US Treasury thinking about it, writing a paper for G7 at the end of February, the harsh reality is waking up, right? Western taxpayers probably won't fund Ukraine's victory. So we have to do this. That's the reality. Now, in terms of your question about reserve currency,
thank you.
Apologies for going on a bit, but you know, firstly, I would argue we're worried. Essentially, the worry is about China and Saudi Arabia and authoritarian regimes, basically fearing similar treatments and pulling reserves out of Western jurisdictions. I would argue they've already taken the signal with the move to immobilize. Assets actually are not frozen; they're immobilized, right? I think they've already moved some assets. I don't think they're going to move much more. I think, interestingly, counter-argument would be it sends a very strong signal to those countries not to invade countries, not to commit war crimes after invasion, and not to commit genocide. If you're going to do that, you should have had your assets immobilized, frozen, and seized, I would argue. So, you know, I think the argument's pretty weak. I don't think it will destabilize the dollar. I don't think it will destabilize the euro.
All right, well, thanks very much. There was an utterly pragmatic argument, if you like, though I'm still interested in Yuliya's point earlier that, in your view, it doesn't need changing laws, which is a kind of line of argument I think many governments, including the UK, would be more comfortable with. Rostislav, to go back to your point, what do you make of this? Or do you think this argument is already won and that we're really just into the practical questions?
Just two important inflections and explanations. First of all, about the countermeasures and about the laws. What important Yuliya said, that we do not need to establish the new conceptual and new framework globally. So it exists. What we need the implementing laws and technical decisions. This is absolutely different level. Obviously, some of the acts, like the Repo Act in the US, needs to be adopted. There should be some acts that should be adopted nationally in the European countries, but this is not something fundamentally new. It means that it can be done if there is the political will within months in all the necessary countries. So this is the first reflection. The second one is about disposal and directions of usage of the asset itself. It's a very tricky and important question. The principal position for the Ukrainian government is that this money should be used for the recovery of the country and for the repayment of the damage that was caused to the people. And there is already established international mechanism, compensation mechanism, as an international organization registered in GAC, if I'm not mistaken, and this is the proper way to channel these assets. We should not allow to put us in the wrong way when we will have to fund the war with those assets, to pay for the weapons, to pay for the everything else. Because in 3, 5, 7 years, I don't know, nobody knows how much war will last, a year, 2, 3, 5, 7, we will not have any reserve to rebuild the country. The country will be completely destroyed, and at least we all understand that this is the asset which can be used to rebuild everything, and we will stay with nothing. That's why we should be very careful with this point, with the direction of usage. Obviously, it should be managed, supervised by international partners, but these are the money for the recovery and for the repayment of the damages.
Thank you very much. So, Yuliya, can I come back to you on 2 points that have come up? The first, which Rostislav made at the beginning, in your view, does it make any difference to distinguish between Ukraine taking the interest on these assets and taking the assets themselves, or being given them? And then the second one, which Rostislav was just discussing, is there any legal difference between Ukraine using this for weapons and for reconstruction of the country?
Sure, so I will address the interest argument first. So legally, by making the argument that you can take the profit accumulated from the interest, you are making the same exact legal argument that supports taking the capital itself under settled notions of property law. There's a great quote that constitutional law scholar Lawrence Tribe once wrote saying, going this way, taking only the profits, is like making the misguided move of leaping halfway across a gaping chasm without going the full way. If you're going to go for the prize, go for the big prize. The law supports it. Secondly, there's practical reasons for this too. The profits from the interest accumulated would amount to probably about $3 billion per year. To put it in perspective, the US and the EU have provided Ukraine with about $5 billion per month just to keep its economy afloat. So this $3 billion per year is insufficient to support Ukraine in its victory, much less its rebuilding. There's a conservative estimate that it would take 124 years using just these profits accumulated to rebuild Ukraine. Frankly, if you're making the argument, just go the whole way.
Can I just stop you on that? If we're talking about 300 billion of assets, why only 1% a year?
That has been the estimate that these taxes would accumulate.
And then the second point, does it make any difference whether Ukraine was to spend this money on defense or on reconstruction legally?
Legally, I think arguments can be made for both. There are different ways to justify it, but under countermeasures are meant to stop wrongful, illegal conduct. By using these frozen assets to forward that goal, we can use it on defense spending. We can use it on military spending. The other flip side, we can use it for compensation as well. We could also invoke the doctrine of collective self-defense, and that provides a very clear pathway. So in other words, there are legal ways to do this. They already exist. Policymakers just need to make the choice to do it.
Bill, I want to come to you on really the central point and about the justification for this. And Tim was taking us into it and making this very, very pragmatic argument that he did, was saying, well, look, maybe the West isn't going to come up with enough money, so we've got to do this, needs must. And I just have in mind the kind of cry of double standards that you hear so much from many countries, not in the West, at the moment, and thinking particularly of the Israel-Hamas conflict, and saying, you make up rules to suit yourself is the charge. And how would you rebut the argument from other countries saying, well, look, this is the West making up rules to suit itself because it can't afford to pay?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that we're not making up any rules. There was confiscation in Iraq. There was confiscation in Germany after World War II.
Iraq was the 1990 invasion of Kuwait.
The only difference between this and those stories is that the war is not over. And so normally you wait until the war to end before you go for reparations. In this case, the war, we can say the war has been going on almost 2 years, but the war has been going on since 2014. And from my perspective, and I think many other people would agree with me, Putin's not backing down. Putin will carry on with this war. I mean, he has to have this war in order to stay in power. And he will sacrifice as many young Russian men as he needs to. He will burn through as much equipment as he needs to keep this war going. And therefore, we don't have the luxury of waiting till the end of this war. And I don't want to be in any way disrespect the opinion of the Ukrainian government, but we may not be ever in a position to rebuild Ukraine if Ukraine loses the war. And we're in a position right now where Ukraine is suffering financially. Ukraine is suffering financially. Ukraine is lacking bullets and ammunition. Ukraine is lacking funding from the EU, which has been blocked by Hungary. Ukraine is lacking funding from the US, which has been blocked by a small number of very right-wing Republicans in Congress. And we have the elephant in the room, which is the November 2024 US election. Donald Trump is currently slated to be the Republican nominee. Maybe that changes, but and if you look at the bookmakers, there's a greater than even chance that he's going to become the next president of the United States. If he does, he said he's going to solve the Ukraine crisis in one day. And what does that mean? He's going to cut off Ukraine from funding. And so I would argue, putting aside all these niceties, that confiscating the $350 billion is Donald Trump insurance. And it needs to be done before the US elections so that if that were to come to pass, Ukraine can carry on, defend itself, and win so that there can be a reconstruction.
Thank you very much indeed, and you brought us right to the heart of the urgency that perhaps is one of the reasons why this has come even more to prominence, these arguments in recent weeks. Right, I'd like now, we're just over halfway through, I'd like to turn to questions now, because there are a lot of people here who will have a lot to say, but preferably to ask questions. I'm going to take them in pairs, unless that seems completely inadequate. So if you want to put up your hands. and the three of us are going to share one mic, and all of you are going to share the other one. Who would like to start? Right in here. And if you would like to say who you are, that's great. There is no obligation.
Hi, Lena Kazarny, Horizon Capital, and I've got a question to Bill. Bill, expand on why this is so existential also for Putin. Why, when we've heard all this week folks trying to pressure Ukraine to come to the negotiating table, others saying that you know, this is the only way out, from your personal experience and your perspective, why is he not going to back down?
Okay, great. Bill, do you want to, as that's one direct one to you, let me pass the microphone to you while other people are thinking of their questions.
That's a really important, it's the key question because that just determines everything. So what I've learned in my one-on-one fight with Putin over the Magnitsky case is that, and I'm not saying this speculatively, I'm saying this with real forensic knowledge, is that Putin and about 1,000 people around him over a 23-year period stole $1 trillion from the Russian state. They stole that money that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads. Instead was spent on yachts and jets and villas. And you can do that for a certain period of time. You can do that for a certain period of money, but doing it for 23 years and doing it for $1 trillion is like spreading gasoline all over the floor of Russia, and it's just waiting for a match to light it up. And Putin is a guy who understands that if he is no longer in power, he loses the money he stole, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so if you're a little man like Vladimir Putin is, and you've stolen too much money and you're afraid of dying because your people are going to rise up, what do? You create a foreign enemy and you start a war. And this war in Ukraine is not about NATO expansion. It's not about expanding the Russian Empire. This war is about Putin desperately afraid of dying. And he doesn't care about Russia. He just cares about himself. And therefore, and he thought that this war would elevate his stature. And to a certain extent it has. It's made everybody angry at Ukraine instead of angry at him. But now he's in it. And the one thing you cannot show in Russia is any weakness. And I've been in a conflict with Putin for 15 years. He never compromises, never backs down, never does anything to show weakness, and he won't show it here. And we've seen that by the losses that Russia has taken. Russia has taken more than 300,000 casualties. Any other country, the Soviet Union took 15,000 casualties in Afghanistan. That led to the end of the war. 300,000 casualties. 95% of their tanks are destroyed. The economy is in a mess, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And Putin will not back down, he cannot back down, and therefore it's absolutely essential that Ukraine wins, and to win, Ukraine needs the resources to do so.
Bill, thank you. And I'm just going to pass to Rostislav to say, how do you and the Ukrainian government weigh up Putin's motivation?
I think this is pretty the same as Bill described. So we understand that the key motivation is preserving the power, preserving the control over the petrodollars, and being in the war with the external enemy is the best way to control the society. And very simple emotions lead him, the fear, and that's it. That's why he's not, it will be difficult to get any kind of compromise with him.
Thank you. Okay, there's one standing up there. I'm going to take two this time.
Thank you. Gleb Wishlinsky, Center for Economic Strategy, Kyiv. I have a question on the role of international institutions in this process. You said that obviously decision should be multilateral, at least G7, and in fact it should be supported by institutions. And we see that the IMF is very cautious on the subject, ECB is opposing the subject, European Commission was very slow in coming even with proposal on the interest. How could we overcome these international bureaucracies that need to help in this process? Thank you.
Thank you. Slow bureaucracy, and one here in the front. And there's a whole. We've got good time.
ROSTYSLAV CHATHAM. Just a quick question to Yulia. Russians threatened legal action against it. Which jurisdictions can they actually sue?
That is a great question. Of course, the Russians are threatening legal action. They can threaten all they want. The reality is that there is no realistic international legal forum for which they can bring their claims. They don't recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, which has already issued measures against it, telling it to withdraw its troops. So what is it going to do? File a case in the ICJ when it has blatantly defied its orders? Or is it going to sue in the national courts of the countries that are taking its assets? Is it going to sue the United States? It would be entertaining to see how that process goes. There's really no credible way for them to do it. And the bigger point to keep in mind is that even if they sue, the bigger question is the strength of the case. And this case is very strong. It has a very legally sound foundation. And this is not a winning case for Russia.
And it would go before which court, in theory, if this ever came to a court? How would it be tried?
It would, the most obvious forum would be the ICJ or the courts, the national courts of the jurisdictions confiscating the assets. So for example, the Southern District of New York. It would be interesting to see the Southern District of New York in a legal battle with Russia. And
let's just tease out that point, because the other question was about the slowness of international bureaucracy, and we were all talking upstairs about how that's going to work, but also whether individual countries could act alone if the agreement doesn't come. Who'd like to go on this?
So I think this was summarized by Yulia at the very beginning. You can't ask a bunch of bureaucrats to do this. This has got to be. Well, actually, I remember when I first started the conversation. If you go to a politician like a prime minister, and you say this is a really good idea, let's confiscate the money, they'll go to their lawyer and say, can we? And the lawyer will look at some things and say, no, it's protected by sovereign immunity. If you go back and ask a different question, which is, how do we do this? Then you get the answer that she just gave. And so you go to some bureaucrat at the IMF who is not a politician, they're going to look for a reason not to do it. And so this is going to be a political decision. It's got to be a decision made by the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, Canada, and
New York State, as we're hearing. I mean, how small does it get?
Well, no. If the United States, and by the way, and the other thing which everybody always said in the European Union is, we're a lawful place. We don't. Well, what do? You make a law. And so if there is some legal ambiguity, and there is some legal ambiguity, you have the law on countermeasures, you have sovereign immunity, and so you say in this situation where there is a conflict of law, you draft a new law to say that in a situation where a country invades another country and there's a conflict of law between countermeasures and sovereign immunity, countermeasures prevails, and then you're doing it lawfully. And then the guys who are, the bureaucrats sitting in the IMF or the European Central Bank can go back to their cubicles.
All right, but that is a slow process. Let me take some other questions. Right, so I'm trying to go in order of people sticking up their hands, one on the aisle and over towards the window.
Anders Åslund, Georgetown University. A question mainly to Bill and Tim. It's often said when you can't solve the problem, you had better make it bigger, because then it becomes more important to solve. And you mentioned here, Bill, $1 trillion that Putin and his friends have stolen. It's perhaps half, but it's $1.3 trillion at least offshore of Putin and his friends. And this is mainly not known because of UK legislation. And all British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands. A few years ago, the UK tried to clean this up, and these efforts have died. And you mentioned the Guernsey, $7 billion of Russian sovereign assets. This is outrageous. The big problem here is the UK. What can you do to clean up the UK offshore? Would be interested in hearing both your words. Thank you.
Really good question. Thank you very much. And then one just sort of two along from you. Can you pass it? Yes, you.
Thank you very much. Nick Bilgorski, Nova Ukraine. Is there an alternative to giving Ukraine the assets and instead giving Kyiv loans and using the frozen assets as a collateral? And would that force Russia to negotiate to repay the debt over time?
Okay, thank you. Tim, let me start with you, cleaning up the UK.
Yeah, I'll do that overnight, right? Yeah. I mean, I think the irony of the argument that we're worried about the erosion of the rule of law is where was the rule of law when the kleptocratic money came in? We asked no questions. We talk about KYC. I say RNKYC, rather not know your client, right? So, I mean, come on, seriously. We all knew what the Putin regime was. And we just, apologies, not BLUEBAY, RBC BLUEBAY Asset Management, but the City of London. It's kind of interesting. And actually...
So the law has changed a bit.
It's tighter, it's more difficult, but
where are we now? And does it offer any recourse in this situation to finding out things that were inaccessible a few years ago?
Well, look, I think for me, I think it just erodes the rule of law. The argument against it on the rule of law basis. We're not whiter than white. I mean, come on, let's be serious. Actually, just on the point about the multilateral basis, etc. I mean, it's interesting that Lagarde's job is fighting inflation. She hasn't done a particularly good job on it, right? And her job's not national security. And it's interesting the decision makers have been Treasury, central banks. Again, they don't think national security. This is a national security priority. We kind of have to do it. And in interest, just to make you think about the reality of this, if you look at the IMF program, you look at the recent review document, right? They don't mention use of frozen Russian assets at all. It's not mentioned. There's no discussion paper about it at all. What they do is they construct a financing framework around Ukraine that is a fairy tale. Right, 120 billion bucks of taxpayers' money, Western taxpayers' money, and also a financing contribution from debt relief from creditors, including bondholders like myself. Just to make you think about the reality of this. RBC BLUEBAY, our clients are we're pension fund money, pensioners. So actually, what the US Treasury, UK Treasury, and Treasuries in general have been saying is, we really don't want to go after frozen Russian assets, but what we'd rather like is you guys, pensioners, to write down the debts to Ukraine, take 10 cents on the dollar, because we don't really want to go after Russian assets. And it's the same for taxpayers, right? I mean, our governments are very good at spending other people's money, but not Putin's money, which is kind of interesting. So, interestingly, they'd rather screw Western taxpayers, they'd rather screw Western pensioners, because, imagine, they're going to write a check to pay the money back to Russia. Isn't that incredible? And I think, politically, that should be suicide. It should be a political scandal that we're not doing this.
So you're going to argue for... You're going to argue for taking Russian money before pension funds make
Ukraine needs all the support we can get. As bondholders, we agreed the debt standstill a year and a half ago. There's going to be new treatment coming up. There's possibly an extension of the standstill or debt treatment. We're willing to support Ukraine. We want to. But seriously, when you've got $350 worth of sovereign money, you have to do that first, right? And I think the way the IMF are doing it, and frankly, they're finding excuses not to go after frozen Russian assets, right? And I think that's morally wrong. And actually, as a bondholder, I think it's our duty to highlight it's corrupt, frankly, action by our governments if they don't do this.
350 billion bucks, I should say.
Well,
you left out the billion. I just want to press this point about cleaning up the UK. In your view, has the legislation, things like unexplained wealth orders, a bit more ability to get behind the ownership of assets, has it had any effect?
No.
Thank you. Right. One on the aisle here. Was there someone in the middle, in the white, who put her hand down? Did you put your hand up? And all right, over. It was him. All right, then in the front here, and I will keep trying to take people.
Thank you, Natalia Tozhelyak, solicitor advocate, London and Paris. A question to Rostislav and Yulia. Rostislav mentioned the registry of damages in The Hague under the Council of Europe framework, and I was just wondering. It seems that the policy of the Ukrainian government now is to focus on centralized register of damages and to get the union of countries or the unions to support it, to give it perhaps more legitimacy. Why not focusing on local efforts in different countries to allow more claims, faster processing times and more efficiency? Thank you.
Thank you. And then one here at the front.
Thank you. Timothy Milovanov, Kyiv School of Economics. So in some private conversations with businesses, some of the businesses which exited, Western businesses that exited Russia have buyback clauses where they can get their assets back. And others still operate. And some of these people, I have had conversations like that, are worried that in case of confiscation of Russian assets, Russia will retaliate against private businesses in still operating or claiming not to operate but having these buyback clauses. Two questions. What's the balance of the assets that the West private businesses still have in Russia, either directly or concealed through buyback clauses, and whether these stakeholders lobby against confiscation? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yuliya, let me start with you. Both very good questions on the schedule of damages, if I've understood you right, and on the buyback of assets.
So I can't speak for the Ukrainian government, but I am up to date on what they're doing, what the goal is. So they're working on a macro scale. They're working with a working group of essentially the chief legal counsels of the G7 to first the development of the international compensation mechanism. That will be the macro view. And this includes the Claims Commission and the Register of Damage. And the second part is they're working on the application of countermeasures to fund this compensation mechanism. This also includes working with partners, the coalition of the willing, if you will, the US, the UK, Canada, EU countries. So all of this will require a coordinated effort, and the Ukrainian government is currently working on this. But Rostislav can probably answer that more clearly.
There is no right answer to your question. There is the question only about the estimates, how we believe is the fastest, the more organized, the more legitimate way to achieve the ultimate goal. So based on the previous global experience, like it was in Iraq, Kuwait, like we understand it and discuss with the partners, this is the solution. That's it. This is not right. This is just, we think that based on these criteria, this is the optimal solution.
Thanks very much. All right, right in the middle here.
Can I respond to this one? Can I respond to Timothy? Timothy, on this one, I mean, look, one of the arguments against confiscating and allocating Russian assets is that assets in Russia will be seized. I would argue that, and there's a lot of whinging from Western business, that basically made bad investment calls. I mean, the direction of travel in Russia has been evident since 2014, if not before, right? I mean, many companies had an opportunity to exit Russia before the invasion. Our governments were sending a very clear signal. The fact that they're stuck with stranded assets now in Russia, you know, is their fault. It's their bad call. I mean, Western governments shouldn't bail them out now effectively and subjugate our national security interests to save their arses, excuse my French, because, again, they made very bad investment calls. Actually, can I just answer the gentleman over here also that wasn't answered in terms of, look, I think in the end, this is a war. It's an existential threat to, obviously, to Western. Putin has got the gloves off. We need to pull the gloves off. We need to think outside the box, right? Interestingly, if there's an issue with the property right argument, rule of law argument, why don't we do things like, you know, and there's a problem with the investment return in terms of, you know, if we're investing in US Treasuries at 4%, 300 billion assets is $12 a year, doesn't touch the sides in terms of Ukraine recovery. So let's invest the money in a fund of EM assets paying 10%, right? 30 billion a year. Why not issue Ukraine recovery bonds, right? And Ukraine gets the money. Russia retains ownership of the underlying asset. What's the difference between the assets being held in treasuries or Ukraine recovery bonds, right? If we're going to win, we have to do whatever it takes to win this war, and we need to think outside the box. So I think, yes, and we can use frozen Russian assets and collateralize it for issuance by Ukraine. There are lots of different ways, but you know, we've been fighting, unfortunately, because of our treasury and central banks, we've been fighting this battle with both hands tied behind our backs.
I just want to say one thing on the, you know, the fear that people's Russian assets will be expropriated. Russia started expropriating assets long before, this thing hasn't even happened yet. I was hosting a dinner on Monday, and one of the executives at the dinner was from Hyundai, the Korean car manufacturer. And I wasn't aware of this until he told me, but he said they had a $3 billion car plant in St. Petersburg just expropriated. I think they were paid $114 for it. Of course, Carlsberg's brewery. I mean, there are a bunch of German electricity assets. It's all being expropriated. Every last thing of value will be expropriated, whether we take their money or not. And so it would be an idiotic argument. And I know about Russian expropriation. I'm the poster child of Russian expropriation. I mean, to worry about that, anybody who had assets in Russia should have understood that their assets were going to be expropriated, and that should be a null argument, not even appearing on anybody's pro-con balance sheets.
Okay, thank you. I'm now determined to take this question in the middle. Thank you. And
Catherine Valinga. So I'm hearing we got to do this fast before the U.S. election. We need the money now. It's possible to do. So is there an argument that if we do this now and we do this fast, that the impact on Russia will bring peace faster, rather than the opposite of, oh, we're so scared about what they're going to do, and we can't use it as a negotiating bargaining chip, but doesn't it actually make peace faster?
Really interesting question, taking us in a different angle. I'm going to take several now, and then we'll just take it as the prompts for last thoughts by the panel, because we're coming towards the end here on the aisle.
Thank you. My name is Martin. I'm the CEO of a small Odessa-based waste-to-energy company. It's an advanced startup. We've spoken a lot today about the legalities of getting those assets, which I think is great. Get them. Bill, you spoke about the Russian economy being in tatters. Yes, I hope it implodes tomorrow. My question is more political than legal. How important is the China backs Russia situation really?
Okay, really good question. Again, bringing in something new. I'm going to take these other three, and let's just see what people have to say. And then, Yulia, I'm going to start with you, and we come this way.
Hi, Vasilyatov on Horizon Capital.
Brief questions.
Very, very brief question, comments. My question is about the amount. So we're talking about the freezing assets, but what's the amount and what are the relevant historical precedents that we can use to plant the amount in the minds of politicians in Washington and Brussels? And I have a suggestion, if I may. So Iraq paid 50 billion in reparations for the Kuwait war. It was twice the Kuwait's GDP before the invasion, but it was a 6-month war. So you can extrapolate from there. And it's a much longer war here. And are there relevant historical precedents that we can use just to simplify, dumb down things and place the amount in the minds of politicians?
Brilliant. Thank you. On the edge, over here.
Thank you. Kim Ragaard, Belgium. My question piggybacks onto the lady in white. If this works, if this happens now, which would increase Ukraine's chances of carrying it through in the long term, how do you see that relating to the threat of nuclear escalation?
Okay.
So the other side.
Thank you. And last one. With Save Ukraine on your
Hello,
T-shirt.
yeah. Mykola Kuleba, Save Ukraine. We are talking about this approach.
Would you like to say who you are?
What?
Would you like to say who you are?
Mykola Kuleba, Save Ukraine. Yeah, and I want to ask you about another approach, because we are talking about weapon. Yeah, we need weapon. About reconstruction, yes. But what if we evaluate impact of this war on next generation, on children? Because many children have been forcibly deported. It is pure genocide. Educational losses, health losses. It is a new approach. We have to calculate this. It's much more money.
Thank you very much. Okay, these are terrific questions. We had, will this bring peace more quickly, and also might it accelerate, might it escalate on the nuclear front? We had the China relationship. We had one more about the amount, and particularly about the amounts, and then we had the children, and you might add to that the 10 million and more outside Ukraine, how Ukraine might get those back. These have to be micro thoughts. We're down to the last minute. Yulia.
So about bringing peace quicker, this would signal the West's credibility and capability to show that we are serious. If Putin wants to continue this war, we will have a Ukraine that is strong and that can economically withstand the attacks from Russia. And that is a strategic victory, and that leads us closer to peace. That is the big picture. In terms of precedent, yes, there's a precedent from the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990, where in 1992, the current president, or the past president of the United States, ordered all federal banks holding Iraqi assets to transfer them into escrow accounts. And this was later distributed to the victims of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait with the Claims Commission. A similar precedent could be used here. The only legal foundation that was used are the ones that we already have. There's no new foundation needed.
China's an interesting one. I mean, the reality, I think, is China has not gone out of its way to support Russia, frankly. The fact that Russia has to go to North Korea and Iran for munitions, the Chinese have played a very delicate angle. They really cared about the US relationship. They haven't wanted to damage that by going out of the way to particularly help Russia, right? So I don't think we should be worried about China suddenly going all in to back Russia against Ukraine. I'm sorry?
But are they playing that by North Korea?
I think the evidence is not that Russian financial institutions particularly have backed Russia. I don't think so. And I think the improving relationship between the US and China partly reflects the fact that the Biden administration is appreciative that Russia could have done a lot more to support you. Can I put my points very quickly?
We've only got 1 minute. Will you forgive me?
If we're going to get the money, we need to think about the right institutional framework, about recovery and reconstruction, an agency for recovery and reconstruction, accountability, good reporting, all those kind of things. Obviously, given Ukraine's problems about governance.
Thank you. Okay, the remaining questions are peace, nuclear war, and children.
I just want to say this man is a hero right here, Mikhailo Kuleba. He's the guy who's saving Ukrainian children who've been kidnapped, and there's nothing more important than saving the children. Thank you for your service. Just a really quick one on peace. As I said, Putin is never going to compromise, but Putin is a guy. He's a thug. He's a mafia thug, and we're at war with him. Ukraine is at war with him, and the West is at war with him. And we don't want to put boots on the ground from the West, but the one thing we can do is hit him hard, 2 fingers in the eye. And he values money more than human life. And this would hit him hard if we took his money away. And I think it would be a big humiliation. And to be a tough guy and be humiliated, that's not something he wants.
More on the peace. We believe only the bold decision and the strong leadership can lead to the peace, not the compromises and the fear to escalate. And the decision to confiscate is one of those types of the decision that will send a strong signal that we are bold and we are leaders. As for the China, it seems that the China is absolutely on the sidelines, but the participation of the China helping to set up the peace might be very important. The question is how to engage them and how to match with their national strategic interests, global strategic interests.
Thank you. And just as the final word, in answer to this question about detail, Bill, upstairs you named 2 EU countries where you said most of this money is sitting.
Well, we know that the 220 billion is sitting in Belgium. And I can't remember what was the other country I named.
France.
Germany and France. And of course, Jersey.
Where we started. But I wanted to bring it back to details as well. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for terrific questions. Please thank the panel.
Thank you very much for such an extremely great discussion. Thank you very much. It was an interesting and very important topic for Ukraine. Thank you very much. To keep you warm, this is a small present from Ukrainian designer. So please support Ukraine. We're Ukrainian designers and support Ukraine. Thank you. And just a kind reminder, we will have the next session that will start at 4 p.m. with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba. Please join us for that discussion. Thank you.